So good evening from Holland, wherever you are in the world. Let's dive into this topic. So I want to set the scene, first of all, by quoting from Elijah in the press release announcing the partnership between Black Mountain Investment Group and Indicio. And so this is what you said, Elijah. You said, when we saw the work that Indicio has been doing with biometric authentication and tamper-proof digital credentials and travel, not only did we want to invest immediately in their main business, but we also recognized that their tech is shockingly translatable to the finance industry. Um, so before I actually get you to respond to that, I'd like either Ken or Heather to give just a brief explanation of what it is that are biometric authentication and tamper-proof digital credentials and travel, what they are. How would you explain those to somebody who's tuning in for the first time? They're interested in finance, but they're not so aware of what we've been doing in travel.
Right. So I'll explain the traveler's journey and turn it to Ken to decipher the technology behind it that sets up exactly the vision that Elijah saw and was has been able to carry forward into financial services and lead transformation there. What a ICAO digital travel credential type 1 does is it allows you to basically derive an electronic passport of sorts from your physical paper passport, using the being able to take a photo of the page where your photo is, being able to use your mobile device to open the chip and in your passport and ingest the data, and then confirming that against a biometric selfie test to make sure that the person holding the paper passport is actually the person creating that passport in an electronic version in their device. What that does is it creates a fully seamless digital experience for travel while still capturing the important parts of that paper passport, meaning you hold your own data. You consent to when and how that data is shared, and you provide that directly to the receiving party or verifying party with no third party in the middle taking your data and then passing it along. And so it really captures that freedom of movement that people have with a paper passport. The key there is that biometric combined with identity data in a verifiable credential that can then be used immediately for a decision. So I'll turn it to Ken to talk about the magic and the credential.
It is, in some aspects, quite magical. It is based on cryptography, and it's based on the ability for an issuer to create a credential, pass it off to a holder, the subject of the credential typically, and for a holder to be able to choose to whom they want to share this data with. And that allows them to share to a relying party or a verifier their data in a way that with their knowledge and with their consent. The beauty of the combining a verifiable credential with a biometric contents is that it can bind the data in the credential to the person who is presenting it in a way that's stronger than just having a set of data in a file. Now you have biometrics that you can use both for convenience and for added security. This allows the relying party, the verifier, to ascertain that the credential came from the person that's supposed to be. If you've bound the biometrics to opening the wallet as well, you can tell that the person is not only present, but they're the one that the credential was issued to. And you can match that data to the data in the credential, either a government issued ID, such as a passport or a driver's license or a national identity card or any other type of identity, for purposes of ascertaining that you're dealing with the right person. There's high security and high value in these credentials. So for crossing a border, you have the highest level of security. For financial transactions, that might be equally higher. For entering a lounge at an airport, not quite as high a security as required there, but or dropping off a bag. But those are make the whole experience more enjoyable for the end user and more secure for the relying parties. And that allows that transference of high trust used in the passport situation with a DTC, a digital travel credential, allows for that same level of trust to be incorporated into financial transactions and identifying for either account opening or purposes of controlling an account, that same level of trust to be accomplished. That's and the
And
beauty of it is it's all empowered by the basic fundamentals of the open standards in cryptography that allows for the encryption of the data and its secure transmission.
And what's the beautiful part of what Elijah saw in this transformation is it's not the digital travel credential directly, but he saw and was inspired by that to create something that is uniquely useful in financial services.
Okay, so that's an excellent cue for Elijah to explain why he was shocked by what he saw with authenticated biometrics and a verifiable credential.
Definitely, yeah. And thank you guys so much for laying the groundwork for me there, because this is not a simple technology by any means. And the applications for it are long, wide, and tall and short, and really can fit into so many different arenas across so many different industries. The thing that, really captivated me from the beginning was understanding the deep and broad technical expertise that Heather and Ken have, and what they've brought to their business accordingly is really a fully vertically integrated, fully end-to-end, secure, encrypted, and tech native solution that services both the providers and the users of this application. And so to go kind of further on that of why that matters so much is you look at kind of the institutions or the providers of KYC, right? This idea of digital identity. A lot of these firms are using very outdated practices. They're kind of patching together picture scans and paper verification in person, et cetera. We can go more into that. But essentially, like, their technology is not scalable, it's not well organized, and it's certainly not future-proof to this next world of AI and quantum computing that you can tell Heather and kind of certainly thought a lot about, and actually built their whole business around being anti-fragile too in the face of, which I think is really, really important. And then turning that on the user side, if you're a user and you get a quote unquote digital identity, right, for your Delta boarding pass to get on your first class seat to Monaco or Nice, France, right? Like, you get a digital credential, right? Like, that boarding pass does connect with your account. It proves to the people that you're passing through at security that you are who you say you are. However, to Heather's point, which I think is arguably the most important thing here, before what we're going to introduce, is that as a user, you have no control over that data, right? Like, Delta shuts down your app. You no longer have your boarding pass. Maybe you screenshotted it if you're lucky, but there's one central point of failure. And then just two things really quick, looping that back to the institutions, right? If they're storing all this data, they actually can't go international because of that. And that's an issue that Clear is facing, but there's also other vulnerabilities just from a business safety and security and liability standpoint for storing all those people's data. But then bringing it to the consumer, it's like, consumers are getting smarter and they're realizing that more control over their data is really important to them. And it's really valuable in terms of like the sovereignty that they can have in this world. And finally, I think the main thing that really hit me, and to answer your question very directly, Trevor, is this idea of interoperability, right? Like, using that Delta boarding pass example, I can't use the digital identity that Delta's verified for me to go and do anything else. But what Heather and Ken have built is actually, because it's so closely intertwined with the base layer of technology, it's interoperable across different modems of what you might need that digital identity for. And that's what really got me thinking, like, holy crap, not only is this so much more valuable for institutions based on what they're already doing, but it is so valuable to the user, because that user can take this as their source of truth that they own and control, and then they can go and take it and use it in multiple different places.
So I don't know whether Heather or Ken want to respond to that, but I think there's sort of we've got two really strong paths here. We've got how this technology addresses, the challenges that exist in the sort of commercial and retail banking, but then also the challenges and opportunities it presents to the sort of the massively expanding world of digital assets and decentralized finance. So first, and let's, it strikes me that, especially with AI in the picture, that, biometrics have become are critical to providing the strong assurance for payments and account and remote KYC and account access. How do you see this, playing out? Where are the pain points for commercial banks and the high street bank and customers in traditional IDV method, identity verification methods?
Definitely. I can riff on that, Trevor. And it's really
Sure.
interesting. And I think to highlight the importance of what we're dealing with here, I'll just kind of tell tale of two cities, so to speak. And one is this futuristic city of AI and crypto and blockchain and quantum computing. And then you have the other city, which is like modern society and the biggest financial institutions and legal institutions in the world that are operating on practices that have been largely the same, monotonous, very, very outdated systems and processes for like at least 10, sometimes 15, sometimes even 20 or 25 years. And what that does is it just like creates this terrible infrastructure where like everyone is just pushing paper, and the new person that comes into the job is essentially getting like a stack of either physical paper or a stack of PDFs or a stack of other very poorly managed and organized data that the new person now has to like essentially deal with and grapple and try to organize all that data. So what ends up happening is it just like snowballs, right? Like you put one stack of paper down, you get another stack, and it just like builds up these huge mountains of mismanaged data. Now, blockchain was a really interesting innovation to flatten that mountain and organize data better. So I think like that was one thing that was kind of that's kind of like a baseline thing for us to invest in, right? Like someone that understands what data structures and blockchain and kind of like just better management of data can do in general. Because what's AI without properly structured and tagged data? Very little. It's nothing. I've been training AI models for like 7 years now, and that sounds like such a cool or crazy thing until you realize how simple it is to train AI models. And it's really just based on human input, right? You have a sample size of 5,000 pieces of data. You train 500 of them based on your interpretation of what that should mean for the model. Then you extrapolate it to the rest of the model. But again, if you don't have good data, you can't do anything with that. And I think bringing that further into like this world of quantum computing, which is where our huge focus is, and like what we're really trying to invest in is like a post-quantum world. And this is, I think, arguably one of the most important points that Heather and Ken are really on top of, and Indicio as a whole is really on top of, is this idea of building quantum resistant technology. And that's something that is lost on so many people just because of the sheer complexity of it. And I am in no way a quantum physicist or a quantum computer scientist or anything like that. But I do understand, just in brief moments of explanation from people that are way smarter than me, what quantum computing is and what it's going to do for our world. And essentially what it's going to do is make data in its current form very different. And what that means for like users is like Facebook can be hacked, Bitcoin can be hacked, all these traditionally secure websites and technology systems that we're so familiar with are all going to become vulnerable and in theory completely irrelevant because of this technology. And so what do you do about that? We've been researching this for years, and what we found that only two things you can really do known to us today, and if anyone has more, we'd love to hear them, of course, but it's biometric data, is quantum resistant. And then there's lithium ion signatures, which is a blockchain based, very advanced cryptography. And, yesterday I was listening to a podcast with Brian Armstrong talking about how they protect their customers' assets across, all these different safes in all these different countries, but how even that really isn't quantum proof, yet they're working on becoming quantum resistant through the use of some of these really advanced lithium ion signatures and other cryptography, deep cryptography that I don't understand necessarily. But if you like juxtapose those two things, like deep cryptography and biometric data, obviously biometric data is a much more safe, secure, and simple way to get a quantum resistant technology. But bringing it back to Clear as an example, right, like almost $4 billion publicly traded company, they're storing everyone's biometric data. So you might think, oh, on the surface, this is just a company that helps me get through security faster. But if you take a different spin on it, it's like, why is this company holding arguably the most valuable data that the world will ever know in a post-quantum forum? And that's where it gets a little bit unsettling to think about like how this data is used, who owns it, how it's managed and what it can allow you to do. And I think the accumulation of all that into one, like I said earlier, vertically integrated software platform that Indicio has created is just like the epitome of a compelling post-quantum company.
Oh, wow, that's a lot to digest. But yes, the progress in quantum computing has been ferocious. This is I think a thing we emphasize is that we're a sort of a system, a platform, even though it's not, platform isn't quite the correct word, for the next generation of data sharing and identity verification. But even before we get to a quantum world, we have the problems of AI tools being used to sort of force break systems and sort of to generate fraud and steal accounts and hack and even in that dealing with the current problems that say call centers face, we're able to deploy, you can deploy an authenticated biometric and a verifiable credential to essentially prove that you've got a proof that you are who you say you are when if you show up on a remote screen or you show up and that, so that seems to address, key issues we have with biometric identity fraud and so-called deep fakes right now. But that's simply the foundation for moving forward into a even more complex and insecure world. Heather, Ken, any thoughts on what Elijah was saying there?
I think you have a combination of the cryptography suites, which are constantly evolving, whether it's the latest suite, whether it's in which particular library, as they move to more quantum resistant cryptography suites, those need to be plugged in. The combination of cryptography that allows for the sharing of the data in a secure way allows the whole thing to take place, to allow sharing of my identity and with the biometrics embedded in it, prove that I am the right one interacting, whether I'm working with a trading platform for traditional stocks, bonds, or a crypto platform, or whether I'm trying to board a plane. It's ICAO doesn't come out with mechanisms to service financial industry primarily. Their primary focus is to get people securely across the border. But once you have that data available, using it for an alternative purpose to identify a person who wishes to trade rather than travel allows for a secure mechanism to allow them to be onboarded either into a job or into a trading platform and make for a much higher level of assurance than having a human have to look at a paper document, hold it up, figuring out whether or not it's forged or not. Most of the onboarding employees aren't that skilled in looking at documents, paper documents. They are a good measure to have in place that after the machine available things like biometric check, looking at the document and comparing it to the format that it should have by a computer, allow them to make a discretionary call to say, there's something wrong with this whole process and still be able to object. But in most cases, to allow the identity transaction to consummate and then be able to go on with opening the account or authorizing a transfer of funds to occur. This allows for compliance with the regulatory frameworks that are quite stringent in preventing money laundering or the transfer of prohibited persons from participating in financial transactions. So it gives a tool for the compliance by the financial institutions to allow for a much smoother process for the happy customer and the detection of people who shouldn't be participating.
And one of the things, Trevor, is really biometrics are dumb without the associated data or biographics, right? And we have been in a place where the biometrics means that when you present your biometric, it's recalling into a central database to pull those biographics or the data about you, which is fine. That's a phase that we're in right now. But in the next phase of a truly seamless world, you want your data to travel with you. On the other hand, you can't reset your biometrics, right? Your iris is your iris. And if it's breached, well, that's a real issue. And so you don't want to be in a globe where people are spreading biometric data everywhere, because then in the end, it just becomes meaningless. And so what you have with a verifiable credential is the ability to have that empowerment of taking your data and moving it through a seamless experience, whether that be with a financial institution or a law firm trying to prove who you are, to say that I am the owner of an account, or I am the recipient of funds, or I have the right to conduct a certain transaction. And then being able to do so in a way where you are carrying your own biometrics, you are the protector and holder of your biometrics, and that you're able to provide that in a secured way that's tamper resistant, that allows the receiving parties to have that trust that the biometrics presented connect to the data or the associated data in which a transaction or decision is going to be made upon.
So, at a recent meeting, FinAccelerate, held by Jones Day Law Firm, there were lots of representatives from banks, particularly digital forgers at the banks. They all talked about digital identity being critical to the future of the evolution of finance and digital assets. They didn't really seem to have a solution, though, for what that digital identity would be, only that it was necessary. We've recently seen OpenAI's World ID be used to, say, issue short-term crypto loans to average folk. This is Divine Research in San Francisco. How would, that requires, of course, people going to an iris scan machine and having an iris scan taken. Whereas the Indicio solution is you don't need any of that infrastructure. You just need a mobile phone. So it would seem to be a magnitude of order more efficient. Any thoughts on how easy it is
By,
for
by
customers,
taking
consumers to
taking the
create?
biometrics onto the phone, you make it far more convenient for the end users. It's not that it's a simple technology. They've just bundled all the awesomeness into the phone camera and an ability to take a high quality photo, do liveness checks to be able to do sensitivity to subtle light changes to make sure that it's not a poster of me being held up and turned slightly one way or another. But the idea of encapsulating all that technology into the phone, it gives you the access to be able to do it. The phone's also capable of doing the cryptography work to encrypt and transmit the data safely. So by having a very powerful compute device in the hands of the consumer, you now put the ability to capture the biometrics. And that could be multiple forms of biometrics. You could do the facial recognition is the obvious one, but it's also possible to do fingerprint or other types of biometrics in the phone and be able to reconcile that with a back-end system to maybe do some of the comparisons so that you're assured that it's the same person and you're not trusting just the mobile platform. That allows for a great deal of power to be put into that mobile phone to enable this technology to occur. Once you've got those biometrics, then you can talk, like Elijah could talk about where can we apply this to make the process smoother for onboarding a customer.
Right. And just to build off that, Ken, I think it's so important to recognize one thing that Heather has touched on a bit, but like all of these quote unquote semi-modern technologies, let's take OCR as an example, which is basically just like a picture reader. Those were considered innovative at the time they became standard practice in these industries and across these large companies. And so, right, if you just innovated in, call it 2013 or 2015, and you have this like modern technology in your business, and you aren't paying attention to the other innovations that are happening in technology 10 years from when you implemented that, right? You don't realize necessarily, especially if your profession is law or banking or some other industry in the world where you're not like following the most cutting edge technologies. One big issue with that is like AI really is allowing more deep fakes to happen ever before on those like not very modern, but call it semi-modern technologies that a lot of these firms are using for biometrics. An interesting way to think about this might be a medical device, right? If you are in a hospital and you're needing a serious procedure, you might get plugged into a huge device that costs like $250,000 to bring in there, and it's taking some measurements, and then the doctor at the end of the day will push a button and it will print out like your results, and then that doctor will go and do some manual calculations on those results to give to their manager, and that data was never tracked anywhere, it was never stored, and that device again cost $250,000. The company we went in toward had literally put together like a couple $100 smart device that you just plug into the actual needle in your arm that does the same measurements, and it's tracking them in an organized way, uploading them to the cloud. So to Ken's point, what can you do with that? The application is endless, but what could you do before when the data is not structured and not organized and actually not really what it's representing itself to be? And we can go, and Heather can probably expand a lot more on that with like a digital identity versus a verifiable identity. But the problem is like these innovations do happen fast, and they get presented to people in industries that aren't necessarily as knowledgeable of these modern technologies. And therefore the decision makers and leaders of, call it the finance industry or the legal industry, are operating on outdated information of what is actually cutting edge without necessarily thinking about or understanding the future, such as quantum computing and AI deepfakes, and what you need to do to essentially be resistant to both of those type of waves.
One of the things Trevor, Elijah, and I have talked about is here we are heading into this Web3 world, digital assets, crypto, decentralization. And then what's the identity behind it? Web2 centralized identity. It's like we've decided to innovate and transform everything, but the underpinning of trust in everything. And that just sometimes boggles the mind about how we go into these Web3 digital assets. And then when they do decide that identity and KYC is important and regulations are requiring it, then we go backwards into Web2, federated or centralized identity. And in one way, that just completely defeats the innovation and transformation that we've worked so hard to achieve to hit Web3. So it is, in one hand, mind-boggling that we can go all the way through Web3, but then continue to make the mistakes around lack of privacy, correlation, and tracking, and decide, let's just carry all of that right with us into Web3. And that's something that we are laser focused on is the area to innovate right now in Web3 is identity, and doing so in a way that protects the privacy, meets emerging privacy and compliance around the world, and also make sure that people have the ability to provide appropriate levels of consent and ensure that their digital life can travel with them across their entire history and not be compromised and breached to the point that they've lost all their identity going forward.
Good point. Well, the sort of anybody in the financial world who's looking at the sort of evolution of digital assets and finance is going to focus in on cross-border payments as a key way in which savings can be made and efficiency can be and transactions can be much more efficient. Is this, we've talked at a fairly high level about identity and the sort of the future of technology, but in practical terms, what can financial services companies and digital asset companies do with identity based around authenticated biometrics?
I'll answer that, but Heather, do you mind giving kind of the audience a general overview of this difference between a digital identity and a verifiable identity? Because I think that's really important kind of to the application.
Yes. Sometimes, we like to say not all digital credentials are verifiable credentials, and you can issue a digital credential using a proprietary or walled garden technology that allows you to move data in the form of a credential, but that credential is still controlled by the entity that issued it. That credential is likely only useful within that platform or within that company or maybe their partners. And in the end, you have very little control about being able to use that same credential elsewhere as your life needs to. A verifiable credential is one that is encrypted in a way that provides portability. It meets open standards, it meets protocols and credential formats that allow for interoperability, and so it frees the digital credential that many proprietary solutions have moved into the market today. And that's really important because what it does is it creates an entire new channel of revenue, of interactions, of customer experience that cannot be achieved when you have a locked up credential that is controlled by one entity.
Definitely. And unfortunately, what has happened is actually a reversion of innovation to Heather's really fascinating point. Like we've arrived at this really advanced state of Web3 technology. However, if you've been paying attention or working in the space over the last 5 years in the US, you've realized that the US institutions had this moment of panic where anyone outside of US based brokerages for digital assets or digital asset banks or other kind of financial institutions in the crypto space, there was really no KYC at all, right? Like you can onboard to Binance, I think still with zero KYC. And that for a US institution like a Citadel or a BlackRock or a Charles Schwab is a huge issue, right? Because if anyone, probably everyone on here has, gotten a bank account, gotten a brokerage account, you have to give them your social security. It might take days or weeks to get verified. And we can kind of talk about those processes as well. And one funny story that's a more recent one is like we're working with, the literal biggest and best bank in the world. And for them to verify our identity, we need to bring 2 physical identities into an in-person branch for a physical person to like do that touch and feel test that Ken was kind of joking about, but it's like really still happening again at the biggest, best bank in the world. And they're like using their, banker's best judgment for if this paper document is real and if the person seems like it's the guy in the ID, right? It's kind of a joke, but it is sadly not a joke because it is what all these institutions are using as what they have as their best current solution. So again, with what Heather and Ken have done here by going to that base layer and making the identity itself verifiable, it's a little bit nuanced, but what Heather's saying is really important because look, not only are you verifying that it's the person who it says on the identity, but you're actually verifying that the identity is real, right? Because like you could be sent a picture of someone's passport, but with AI, maybe that's an AI created passport that looks exactly like the guy who created it, right? And we will continue to see a lot more of that. And then bringing it back to your initial point here, Trevor, of cross-border payments, that is something that's really holding everyone up. And that's why the institutions I've mentioned before that are now launching like multi-$100 million, if not billion-dollar crypto ETFs, non-custodial exchanges, et cetera, have all clamped down really on KYC in the traditional US structure of KYC that again is really outdated, does not have any interoperability across any other place. And so what is happening currently, which I'm not afraid of, but I would love to see it not happen, is a real concentration of wealth and power in the same institutions that have had the wealth and power in traditional finance. I would much rather see what a world that Heather and Ken are building, and you guys all at Indicio, of more sovereignty, more spreading out of that wealth, and the ability for a person just like myself or anyone else listening to this to have the same authority with their KYC, their ability to know and diligence someone as a top bank or a top law firm would. And that seems like it would be an impossible fairy tale, imagination, pipe dream until these guys built it. And so, yeah, when I saw this, it really blew my mind. And it is remarkable that so few of these really amazing companies out there have really established what is not only like just the current most modern, but again, that quantum proof. And I think someone brought up like the AI deepfakes, which I think is really important too. And that's why we focus on quantum, right? Because if quantum is the ultimate like place to arrive of like, if you can be quantum resistant, you will be AI resistant, you will be blockchain encryption resistant, right? And so a lot of companies, a ton we get pitched on for us to put money in all the time, are just building like the AI resistant stuff, which is great. It's awesome. And there's like, call it 95 out of 100 entrepreneurs are in that space of like building something really innovative, but still falling short of what the true innovation is going to be of the quantum resistance. And once you build to that, then it encapsulates everything else before it. And that's where I think this transformation is going to be largely about education and exactly explaining what Heather just did about it's not just verifying the person with the document, it's actually verifying the document with the document, which is like a little bit confusing at first, but once it clicks and you understand like the difficulty and the potential fraud that is already occurring and is certainly going to keep occurring, then it starts making a little bit more sense on how important that really is.
So, one of the things, and actually before I make my point, if anybody has any questions, please either, notify us in the chat, and we'll turn to you. You can ask the question yourself, or you can write the question out, and I will recite it, and the speakers will respond. So one of the things that we've talked about the whole process of using authenticating biometrics, the sort of so you have you authenticate the person, you authenticate the biometric, you authenticate the document, and then you bind them all together. We talk about this as sort of government grade digital identity, and that phrase came from the ability for a person to get pre-authorized to travel internationally and to cross a border. But in a sense, when you start thinking about this in finance and banking, and especially in digital assets, it sort of democratizes all these new forms of digital finance, because suddenly everybody can participate because they can absolutely prove with the assurance needed, to be certain in their identity that they are who they are. How does that begin to change, people's experience of whether it's, sort of people's experience of banking, but also, investors' experience of banking and conducting transactions? I mean, what is the real, so say you have, what's the real practical impact of a technology, like regarding leaving aside its adoption, but a technology that allows you that certainty? What does that mean in terms of efficiency, savings, ease, scale? How do you see this play out on the stage of finance as it's happening?
Certainly, I think kind of in that line of thinking where you're going to have actually a lot more volume, right? Like you're going to have more and probably a lot faster of money transferred across the globe. I think that's like the net effect is there will be like more volume, which I think is in theory a really good thing. But then some of the more nuanced details, I think really depends on how we execute with this partnership in terms of getting it into institutions, right? Because on one hand, if the institutions understand what we're bringing to them and the importance of it, which I do think will really be the biggest challenge again, is like this education, again, why I'm so grateful to be doing stuff like this. And I think you guys have such a great and thoughtful approach on because of how cutting edge this stuff really is, right? Like it's not like you can just pick one part of the technology you guys have and say, that's the innovation, right? It's actually like that plus that plus that plus that all tied together into one is the innovation, right? And so most people, I think, especially if their focus is outside of technology, it takes them quite a long time just to understand one of those pieces. And then a piece ties to another piece, right? And all of those together really is what's difficult to understand. But that's why I'm thinking the institutions that actually adopt this sooner will dramatically speed up their KYC process, which will increase volume, especially on a short-term basis. So I think in theory, the institutions that adopt this quote unquote like enterprise solution version of what we have here, they will in theory like have more throughput, not only with their clients and just like the speed of client acquisition, but their clients will probably have a better experience. So therefore they have more retention of users and clients. And then their clients will also spend more money faster, transfer more money, interact more on their platform. But at the same time, there could be this derivative effect where if everyone really is interacting financially in a peer-to-peer way across borders, where those institutions do lose some of that volume, some of that AUM. But realistically, I think just given like some of the some of the guardrails that we will be operating inside of from international compliance standpoint will require us actually just to be a piece of that puzzle that speeds it up rather than completely disintermediating them.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts?
I think it's also interesting to note that although this is a new and cool technology, it doesn't have to immediately supplant everything that's already going on in KYC. It's an add-on. It's an enhancement. It's a boost of confidence or a higher assurance level, but it doesn't have to. Not all the customers have to go through it. You can set up a parallel track and elevate one part of your process, and then another, and gradually ratchet things up to improve things. So it's an immediate benefit, but it doesn't have to be a rip and replace. It can integrate with existing systems. That's part of the beauty of it, is that we're not reinventing KYC. KYC, the know your customer mechanisms are, establish who the identity is, and you may have to do some other background checks or whatever. But the idea of plugging this in to both speed up and increase the reliability of a particular part of the process provides immediate benefit and immediately reduces fraud and misuse of funds, and allows for greater confidence in the participating parties to be assured that they're talking to the right person at the other end. And all of this is, I think, a stepwise process, which makes it easy to take that first step, and then you can add more steps and more benefit as you go.
How do we see sort of beyond simply identity verification? Verifiable credentials enable all sorts of data to be put in, created and shared in tamper-proof ways. The promise of decentralized finance is that there's a radical simplifying of all the back-end operations around banking. How might this technology, and of course, the other thing that the communications protocol enables my mobile device to start functioning as, have the functionality of an API, so I can actually do far more data-intensive things with my mobile device than I previously could have. How is that going to really transform the industry? I mean, this is the bit where we go beyond the immediate problems and think about, well, what are the really, how does this transformation play out once we've kind of gotten the identity verification part of it sorted?
The immediate next step is we apply this to emerging AI technologies. Right away, you can establish the identity of the AI so that I know I'm not being phished. The AI knows that it's talking to me, so that there's a secure identity of the account that's using the AI. Plus, you can seed information from credentials directly into the AI to facilitate the conversation, to get better results, to avoid fat fingering, typing of your 12-digit number that the AI needs to do something. Beyond that initial identity mutual authentication bit and the feeding of data in, you can start to enable agentic AI to prove delegation of authority, to prove that it truly is authorized to act on my behalf, and it may have limits associated with it. It can execute a trade, for instance, up to $10,000, but it can't execute a $100,000 or $1 million trade. Those types of things can be embedded in the delegation of authority. It makes it so it's more trustworthy and traceable. It makes for a much smoother experience for the end user, and eliminates the minutia that the user has to take care of, and allows the AI to really provide some benefit to an end user. Also, that provides the benefit to the organization hosting it. For travel, help a passenger get to their destination more quickly. For finance, guide them to the correct products, or those sorts of things. Some mundane things that you can put in credentials also are enabled, such as my wire transfer instructions are in a credential. You can prove it came from me. The typos are gone because it's embedded in a credential. The wire transfer proceeds with a surety that the money goes from A to B. It provides a better mechanism rather than into some random blank 14-digit number with a typo in the middle of it to put it in the wrong account. So it removes those errors and on the simple end and allows all the way up to agentic AI that can prove its authority came from proper delegation.
So that's in a sense it's error-free automated data with multiple layer ways to orchestrate and delegate that data, how that data is used.
Yeah.
That does that excite is that an exciting future, Elijah?
It really is, and I've literally never thought about that concept of verifying the identity of an AI. Ken, that's fascinating. But last night in my like near midnight email to Heather and the rest of the Indicio team, I was starting to get at like that idea of where you take this and actually like what manifestation of form you can get this like verification in, right? Because of course you could do a blockchain signature, you could do, some sort of encrypted token or really anything. And that, to Ken's very interesting thought here, can just open up a world of trust on an internet that is, I wrote kind of a huge thesis on this last year. I'm happy to share it, but I do believe our energy grid worldwide, but particularly in the US, is not equipped at all to handle like, the modern hyperscaler AI technologies that are going to be mass producing content already are, right? Like I saw some graph about like all the video content that's ever been created by humanity in like the last 6 months is like more combined, more than like the whole human history combined. And so we're really going to run into a lot of, I think, data processing and storage issues just based on the sheer amount of content that's being created already, text content, picture content, video content. But then like furthermore, and this is something a lot of people in my generation talk about that are like huge on Instagram and kind of have that as their like token of authenticity, right? Is there like, couple 100,000 or million followers, right, on Instagram, and that's their source of truth, is like, oh, it's coming from my real account because you can check how many followers it has. But actually bringing this idea of like a verifiable identity to social media, to content creation, to, like Ken said, AI models, very interesting, to the banks themselves, right? Like you imagine if you have a smart contract where banks automate their customers' desired transactions based on, their platforms. And I mean, there's really so much interesting application there. I think about military application a lot. I think about medical application a lot, especially again, just moving towards this world where real estate is getting more secure. And in a lot of ways, and by that, I mean like data centers, right? Like to get into a modern, truly secure data center, you have 3 gates, you have robotic dogs, you have drones, you have EMF, you have all sorts of like really crazy stuff to get through. So I don't think like that world necessarily of like dystopian robot breaking into your data center is necessarily like the biggest concern here. But I do think this concern of like who's accessing that data, are they the person or group that they say they are, and then also decision making, right? Because again, like in this abundant world of so much information, so much content, and therefore so many institutions, right? Like it's never been easier to start a business. You can code an app with your voice on a new AI coder just released last week, right? And so I think really just to Ken's point, like there's going to be an abundance of institutions. There's going to be an abundance of options for consumption and for knowledge share, and education is going to change. But again, like medical, military, government, travel, finance, all of it is going to require sifting through a lot of noise and getting to a very direct, pointed, and trusted signal. And really right now, I do believe without Indicio's tech, there is literally no way to do that, because of all this patchwork, all the centralized data that Heather's talked a lot about. I think is like such an important point. And you bringing it back to quantum, I know this is like some distant thought in a lot of people's minds, but Google actually did release a fully functional quantum computer. And so, you start thinking about what might happen if you lose your biometric data and someone uses it nefariously without any verifiable credential layer. It just could really unleash a lot of havoc, as opposed to this idea that Ken's proposing of like funneling down all that noise into like a very clear indication of where that information is coming from and why you should trust it.
One of the interesting things that I was talking about digital twins with somebody who was working with a fire service, and the level of granular detail that they're using open source data to decide where they're going to place fire stations and optimal routes and, people, most at-risk populations, is this an aged population? It gets really interesting when you start thinking of digital twins and digital objects and being able to people can have permission to access systems virtually in models of, well, cities, factories, hospitals. This is all amazing until there's an identity breach. And things get really dystopian very quickly. So yeah, there's so many applications for something as simple as data you can trust. We
Right.
are
And
getting
on the
close to
other
the
hand,
end, so I'm going to leave it
oh, yeah.
your
Oh,
parting
I
comments
was
to Heather.
I was going to say, Trevor, what you describe. On the other hand, we're at this moment of a digital avalanche on humans, right?
Mhm.
There's only so much digital you can drop on people, and then you start losing value, and you're actually paying money to adopt technologies to bury the humans and customers that have the data, the transactions, the wealth, and everything that you need to drive your business. And so this is really a moment where you have to step back and say, okay, the amount of friction an individual goes through to wire money, to do KYC, to pay a bill. At what point do you say we need to remove that, but do so in a way that is trusted, that brings authoritative data, and provides the consent? And we're at that moment. And Verifiable Credentials offers that path forward for financial services to finally get us at the way from that point of a digital avalanche and allows people to dig out and for businesses to create new streams of revenue because they're not spending money to bury their customers under friction in UI, UX, and then not trusting them because they don't know who they're talking to.
Right. And Heather, I think something I just thought of as you were explaining that's really important here is a lot of people, I think, especially that haven't worked in high finance or technology, have this conception that a misconception, in fact, that it's like institutions versus people. I think there's like this weird tension, whether it's a government institution, a financial institution, you name it. And like, look at the shooting yesterday, right? It is like in Blackstone's headquarters. No one really knows the details, but like, United Healthcare CEO. There's like a lot of kind of examples and like real world examples, but also just like sentiment, right? That's being shared on Instagram and Twitter, like where there's seeming to be a lot of distrust and a lot of actual hatred and tension between people and institutions. What this does, just exactly like you said, Heather, is weirdly builds trust between people and institutions in a very level playing field way. And I think actually bridges an important gap that exists between them currently, where institutions to users, especially like a KYC process, for example, feels like a total black box. Like, what are they doing with my info? What the heck? Like, how are they verifying it? How do I know that? How can I trust them as the user? And like, what are they doing with my information? Are they selling it, right? Like, are these banks, exchanges, Clear, whoever, are you just don't know. Are they selling my data? Facebook is, right? Instagram's totally just mining you all day. And there's a lot of stuff on this too about like your phone actually takes a picture of you every 5 seconds. They're reading your facial recognitions, how you're responding to things, like training massive AI models on that. And I really do think we've reached a point in society where consumers are tired of feeling mined, like you're saying, Heather, and tired of feeling like they're in this black box. And I'll just quickly, sorry to talk so much, everybody, but I'll just quickly tell the story of like why because we had already invested in Indicio for this just innovative identity tech. And then we needed to verify a passport for something we were working on that unfortunately we didn't get to in time because there was nothing for it. And it actually ended up being the largest Bitcoin transaction in history, which, Galaxy Digital completed. And I'm sure they had their own methods to do this, but we were trying to verify a passport and we're working with amazing law firms, amazing banks, amazing exchanges, the best in the world, all names you would recognize. And literally none of them have a system or process to verify an international passport other than just the standard database querying, like, are they on OFAC? Are they on Interpol? But that doesn't answer all the questions we've talked about of like, is that person who they say they are? Is that passport a real passport? And so that led us really just to talk to all of our portfolio companies, all of our investors, advisors, our partners, just to try to find something for this. And when these guys were, we were getting into it, it just clicked so instantly. And it makes me wonder what would have happened rather than this land grab of US institutions and crypto, which I do think actually will end up being a good thing for the industry and for the world. But I really wonder what would have happened to like the movement of crypto, the general volume and liquidity in the space over the last 5 years, if these institutions did have a solution like this that allows them to trust users more, and as the user allows the user to trust institutions more, because rather than it being like this looking at each other almost in like a highly contentious and almost like face-to-face sort of way, I think this actually allows us to like coexist with institutions in a way that feels very comfortable for both people, and from a user's perspective in a way where you're not getting used and you're not in the dark, and from an institution's perspective where it's foolproof on their end, so it's highly secure and a lot less liability for them.